Okay. Hey, everybody. This is Jeff Martin with Magic City Books. I'm so thrilled to have you back here for our virtual author series, which we have resumed here in this new year of 2021. We kicked it off last week with the great Ann Patchett, which was a really, really fun event talking about her wonderful novel, The Dutch House, and much more. And we're going to keep doing these. We started doing these, believe it or not, almost a year ago, and we'd never done a virtual author event before, but we're going to keep trying to do them on Monday nights and Thursday nights for the most part. So a couple a week until we can, do it safely and gather again, which we will do, but just not anytime in the near future. But I'm looking forward to maybe a summertime or a fall when maybe we can even do some outdoor kind of components. So I look forward to seeing you all there, but thanks for sticking with us and watching what we're doing. We're going to keep trying to bring you a real fun mix of, serious topics and some moments where we can talk about things where we want to escape, some humor, some fiction, some all kinds of different stuff. We kind of very much view it as a kind of a mixtape where we're trying to provide you a playlist of all the different emotions and feelings that we can do. Couldn't be more thrilled to be joined by our guest tonight. I've been a fan of Harold McGee's for quite some time. And it seemed like, for a period of time, he was omnipresent in the media that I was following. I'm, reading, different magazines, of course, seeing different food shows like, for example, The Mind of the Chef on PBS, which was such a wonderful program put together by the now defunct magazine Lucky Peach, and Anthony Bourdain was involved with that, the great David Chang, and so many different other people were part of that program. And if you haven't seen it, I'm sure it's out there streaming somewhere. You can find it on one of the streaming services. It's just one of my favorite food shows of all time. And Harold played his normal role, which I always say is kind of the Mr. Wizard of the food world, and providing his expertise and such a unique perspective. If you don't know Harold's work, he's written, I think kind of the tomes about food science, and gosh, I think On Food and Cooking came out, it's got to be close to 40 years ago now, early 1980s. Was it 1984, Harold, when that book came out? Yeah, and so
1984, that's right.
yeah, another book we've been talking about in the media lately, 1984, but we won't touch on that. But since then, it's been so great to see how Harold has kind of cemented his place in the world, because he occupies such a unique space, this kind of towing the line between the worlds of science and food culture and all these different things. And I'm excited to chat with him about his new book, Nosedive, which is exactly what it sounds like. This kind of amazingly researched, and we'll talk about the time you spent working on this project, but a book about smell. It's a field guide to the world's smells, and some great, some not so great, some that you'd want to be around all the time, many that you would not want to be around all the time. But it's going to be a real thrill to chat. I hope you guys have questions. If you do, just throw them into the Q&A while we're going, and I'll try to pull some of those while we're going and see where we are. And if you need a copy of the book, which I would encourage you to do, if you go to the chat function here, you'll see a link where you can buy a copy of Nosedive from us and start your own journey of smell. So thank you, Harold, for joining us. I've been really looking forward to this. This is something we've been trying to put together for a little bit of time now, and I'm thrilled we were able to get it done.
Well, I'm grateful to you, Jeff, for your patience, because I think we first talked about the possibility, maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, I'm nothing if not persistent. So thank you for that, and dealing with my my badgering over the years. Congratulations on the book. Happy New Year. It's a strange time to be putting a book out into the world, but what's been the reception like? I'm just curious. This is a book that I know has been in process for quite some time. Your projects are not quick turnarounds. You spend a lot of time working on them. So, what's it been like finally getting this thing born into the world?
Well, above all, it's been just a huge relief to have it off my back, because I promised it to the publisher, I think maybe 2013 or something like that. So for the last 7 years, I've been overdue, and that's not a good feeling. But I felt obliged to take the time, because the subject, as I got into it, just turned out to be way more interesting, and there turned out to be much more information available than I'd imagined when I first started out. So it feels great to have it finished. And so far, the reception has been pretty good. I'm still waiting to hear what people in the science world have to say, but people in the food world, even though it's not primarily about food, have been appreciative of the whole thing. So that's been cool.
You know, for those who don't know, obviously you're very much associated with the culinary world because that's been kind of your wheelhouse for so long. But you know, that's not your background is quite literary. You have I believe a PhD in poetry, I believe, from Yale. Was it Yates? I can't remember or was it Keats? I can't remember. Was it
It was Keats, yeah.
Keats? Yeah. So you studied Keats at Yale and got a PhD in romantic poetry, but now we're here talking about a book about smells, and there's been many decades in between. But how did you kind of land on this pursuit? Obviously, we talked about On Food and Cooking coming out, 1984, so it's not a new interest. But where was that kind of shift for you?
Well, from the very beginning, when I decided that I was going to write about food and not about Keats, I've been especially interested in flavor because, that's the aspect of food and drink that gives us the most pleasure and that I think is most interesting to most people. Back in the 80s, there wasn't a whole lot to say about it because we didn't really know that much either about the stuff in food and drink that creates flavor or what's going on inside us when we experience it. So I wrote what I could at the time, but it's been a persistent interest. And when the 2000s came and I finished the revision of On Food and Cooking, I took a look around, and actually in 2004, I think it was, the Nobel Prize in biology and medicine was given to the people who discovered the olfactory receptors, the molecules in our nose that actually do the sensing of smells. And so the world had changed, and I tried to catch up with it and decided that the next thing I really wanted to do was devote a book to flavor. The closer I looked at that and the more work I did on it, the more I realized that it was going to be a huge subject. And so I decided to see, what particular angle I could take on it. And I decided to focus on smell in particular because flavor is essentially a combination of the senses of taste in the mouth, on the tongue, and then smell in the nose. There are other things going on as well, but those are the two main things. And I decided because taste is relatively limited to, a half dozen or so different sensations. Smell is where all the variation comes, how we can tell an apple from a pear, for example. I thought I would focus on that. The more I focused on smell in foods, I began to think about the smells of other things, because so often foods remind us of other things. And, that's maybe clearest in something like wine, where, wines can have flowery smells, they can have leathery smells, they can have not very nice smells. And so I began to wonder, why do we make those associations? And that led me to realize that in order to understand smells in food, I should really understand smells in general and why everything in the world that has a smell has the smell it does. And that ended up being the final focus, was to make food a part of the story, but only part of the story.
You talked about food reminding us of other things, and we talked about, this is obviously, it's about one sense, but it's in some ways it touches on every sense, right? There have been times in my life when I've wondered, how good is my sense of taste? How good is my sense of smell? You see people like these wine experts with their noses buried deep in the glass, or people doing, these blind taste tests and things. And, even just like a basic activity where if you close your eyes and you put something in your mouth, some food, you wonder, could you guess what it was if it was, if someone didn't tell you what it was? And I always think I wouldn't be as good at that. My sense of taste and smell are not as robust as I think, because my visual plays such a huge role in understanding what what I'm eating or smelling at that time. Just you on a personal level, how do you kind of start to understand this? Do you grade your own sense of taste and smell? You know, have you always thought that you had a good palate, I guess is the word that we would use for something like that?
Uh, I've, as I say, I've always been interested, fascinated, delighted by flavors, but I wouldn't say that my apparatus is especially uh, good at it. And in fact, you know, uh, over the course of my writing about food, I've seen the rise and then the kind of fading of so-called molecular gastronomy, the kind of avant-garde approach to food. And a big part of that was actually doing exactly what you're saying, which is to take away the visual cues that usually kind of predetermine how we're going to experience a food, so that we experience it fresh. You know, we look at something and it's a bunch of mounds of powders and gels and flakes and things like that. You have no idea until you put it in your mouth. And even when you put it in your mouth, sometimes you have no idea. I remember going to Jose Andres's restaurant in Washington, D.C., where that was exactly the point of one of the courses, was to give you these little colorless gels and have you try to figure out what the flavor was in those gels. And you were sitting at a bar with 6 or 7 other people. We were all comparing notes because none of us could get all of them. Sometimes one of us would recognize something and sometimes not. So it's just to say that our perception of food and drink and smells is very much dependent on our own experience, you know, what we recognize, what's familiar and what's not. It's also very much dependent on the context. So if we have visual cues, that really does help. But it's also something that we can learn to use better simply by paying attention to it. And, you know, sometimes doing these little exercises with friends, you know, just put together a series of things in jars, you can't see what's inside, and pass them around and see who can guess what's what. And the studies that neurobiologists have done have shown that sommeliers, for example, who are experts in determining, you know, very fine distinctions among different wines, um, what they really have is not so much a refined sense as a lot of experience stored in their database that they can compare that information with and find the right reference. So, and that's just a matter of experience and enjoying, and, you know, I think it's a wonderful excuse for eating and drinking as widely as possible, and walking through the world and just paying attention to as much as possible.
When you watch a film like some of these movies about, you know, wine experts and things, and we, you know, we'll often see this kind of parodied oftentimes, you know, the kind of wine snob of that. And you'll see some wine, they'll say, well, I get hints of this or that, or this one smells like an envelope from 1945 or something totally crazy. You know, do you see that and kind of think of it as, is that some kind of superhuman skill that these people have attained? It's something they're born with. You know, talk about kind of the nature versus nurture side of smell. If it's because it almost seems as if it's a muscle that can be trained in a certain way.
No, it absolutely is a muscle that can be trained. And the thing about um, sort of professional takes on taste and smell is that sometimes, excuse me, it's difficult to distinguish, you know, genuine report of what a person is experiencing with the filter that often comes up to you know, kind of give you the sense, well, this is an authoritative person who knows what he's talking about, he or she. And so there are lots of different motivations for smelling particular things in drinks and foods and that kind of thing. Questions of expertise and that kind of thing. And that's one of the reasons I actually did the book the way I did. because that's sort of our general experience when people talk about smells and try to break them down. We sometimes have this feeling, where did that come from? And is that real? Is that something that, you just have to check off some boxes for different kinds of smells in order to complete the list for a particular product? So what I wanted to do was find in the scientific literature objective evidence that there were particular volatile molecules in those materials that contribute to their smells. And in that way, kind of distinguish what it is that chemists do in analyzing the smells of foods from what professional tasters do when they're talking about particular products. So I tried to ground it as objectively as possible. All that said, experts have a lot of experience, and they'll go through a farmer's market smelling everything, so that those smells are fresh in their minds, so that if they come across a hint of it in something else, they'll be able to pick it up and identify it. Whereas we who may not have smelled a blackberry in a few months might struggle to recognize that that's what I'm smelling in that particular thing. So it really does work both ways, always, and it's up to individuals really to take the interest in just getting more out of that sense, which we often just take for granted, by paying attention and kind of interrogating our sensations and saying, what is that? I kind of recognize that. Take a few seconds to try to figure it out.
The role of memory and sense memory and smell, we often talk about taste in that. Of course, the most obvious and famous example of that would be Proust and the biting into the Madeleine and how it sends him on this journey. That's very, cliche at this point, but smell has that. Obviously, taste and smell are inextricably linked, and that plays a role in that too. Talk about some of the things. I'm kind of interested in kind of the darker side of the smell, right? Meaning, there's a common condition called pica, right? Which is where people will get the urge to eat, non-organic materials. This is very common in pregnant women, for example, that want to eat like dirt or something like that. Smells that are quote unquote not good smells. Is there something that people can be drawn to, ammonia, other smells that are just off-putting? Is there something in us that kind of draws us to those if you have a certain condition or a certain genetic makeup?
Well, it does turn out that our impressions of smells, the way that we evaluate them, is very much dependent on experience and culture. So young children go through a phase where, as any parent knows, they'll put anything in their mouths because they haven't been trained to recognize some smells as bad and other smells as good. And then if you go all the way into adulthood, you see that there are, tremendous differences among people in what they like and they don't like. And some people are famously disgusted by cilantro, and other people love cilantro. So there are lots of different things going on there. When it comes to things like ammonia and smells of decay, those are pretty universally recognized as warning signals. That in the case of ammonia, it's acrid, it's irritating, in addition to having that particular ammonia smell, and so you kind of instinctively avoid it. When it comes to the smells of decay, there are some situations in which that's okay. An aged ham has been very slowly undergoing that same process, and it's very different from being spoiled. And I try in the book to distinguish between smells of spoilage and smells of fermentation and the various gradations. But it is a continuum, and where people will draw the line between fermented and spoiled is going to depend on where they come from, what they expect, and what they enjoy.
So, a word that seems very common now, but I don't know if I'd really heard until the last 15 years ago, was the word umami, right? The concept of umami. And umami, for those who don't know, is often referred to as what, the sixth taste, or maybe you could explain what umami is.
Yeah, it's a taste that is not one of the classic tastes that had been recognized in Western science for many, many generations. So sweet, sour, salty, bitter, those are all recognized as being basic tastes. But then around the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries, a Japanese chemist decided that based on his experience and his experiments, there was another one, and it was distinct from all of those primary tastes, kind of related to salty, but not the same. And so it ended up with this name umami, which is a Japanese term that essentially means delicious. A good English translation for it would be savory, because it's the taste of monosodium glutamate, which is a component, it's an amino acid, and amino acids are what you find for the most part in animal foods, in meats, in cheeses, and things like that. And it gives you the sensation of, it turns out to be actually a little difficult to describe.
I often hear it described, for examples would be like a Parmesan cheese, or like maybe a Worcestershire sauce, things like that. It's easier almost to give examples than to try to explain what that is. My question, I believe, though, is there the smell component of that, right? That's very much focused on the way it tastes. That's this fifth flavor. But what role does smell play in that sphere of kind of the food and eating world?
Well, the way I like to think about tastes and smells is that tastes provide kind of the foundation of flavor. So there are 5 or 6, or maybe a couple more, because with now umami having been verified by not only by Japanese experience but by basic science, so it's been accepted. There's the possibility that we've missed a couple of others, and so people are looking into that. But however many there are, it's no more than a dozen or so. And what they do is, the way I think of it is they provide sort of the foundation of flavor on which the superstructure of smells and aromas is built. And so they anchor those kind of elusive aspects of flavor, the ones that kind of come and go very quickly. They anchor them on your tongue, in your mouth, so that they persist and so that you can enjoy them. But it's the superstructure. Smell is. There are about 400 different receptors that we have for detecting smells, and they act combinatorially. So we have the opportunity to smell many, many thousands, maybe millions of different molecules, not just the dozen or so of taste, but many, many, many more. But as I say, they're elusive. They come and go with our breath. What's on our tongue persists and helps ground those other sensations.
I'm curious to, we'll play a little bit of a game, which is, I'm thinking about, around the globe, if you had to think of a few smells that would be associated with different parts of the world, right? I was thinking, like, what if you had to describe America, the idea of America and some smells? Someone might say like a steak on the grill in the backyard, like that kind of charcoal grilling smell, or maybe like baking apple pie or chocolate chip cookies in the oven. Or, there might be some things that would kind of fit in with the idea of what you think that place might be. Northern Africa, maybe like rose water or something like that. Do places have distinct smells that are associated with them based on country, continent, all these different things?
Well, I can speak from personal experience. I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and every time I get off of a plane and walk outside to get a ride at the airport, I smell the eucalyptus trees that are planted in here in Northern California. Now, it turns out that eucalyptus are not native to this place. They came from Australia, and they replaced all the redwoods that were cut down for timber. Um, but there is that kind of environmental smell in many places. Of course, most obviously, if you're at the seashore or in the woods or something like that. Um, but then beyond that, there are the smells of the local industries, whatever they might be. Those may be not so nice. I only have to drive an hour or so from the eucalyptus around the airport, and I'm in the middle of oil refineries, and then you get the smells of industry.
Well, yeah, it's interesting thinking about like getting on a New York subway and going into a New York subway station. It's something that's not particularly pleasant, but it's immediately recognizable. Yeah.
Yes, and the difference in smells between the New York subway, the London subway, the Paris subway, the Moscow subway, they're all underground tunnels for conveying people, but they're completely different in the way they smell.
How do you, we have units of measurement for everything, heat, the flavor, there's the Kelvin scale, these different things for how is there a comparable way of measuring and tracking smells?
There isn't, and that's partly to do with the tremendous diversity of things that cause smells. So there are, as I say, thousands of molecules that we can detect with our nose, but our receptors for those molecules have very different affinities for them. They have very different sensitivities. So some things may be, there may be a lot of those molecules in our neighborhood and we're just barely picking it up. In other cases, there only may be a tiny handful in the whole room, and you're able to pick them up right away because for whatever reason, that particular receptor is as sensitive as it is. So there's no objective way, apart from just saying, what is the minimum concentration at which you can detect particular molecules? And that gives you a kind of ballpark idea of our sensitivities. But because we're all different creatures, we have different genetic influences. None of us have the same exact set of receptors as everyone else, and our brains process those smells very differently. So there just isn't the kind of objective measure of that sensation the way there is the objective measure for something like temperature.
Yeah. I want to get to a couple of questions we've been asked from our audience here. One is Shelley, who is asking, are there certain smells that have been lost over time?
That's a really interesting question. There are, because I come from the food world, the first thing that comes to my mind is a herb called silphium, which was very, very important and prized in classical times in Greece and Rome, and apparently was so prized that it was picked to extinction. It was never domesticated, so it all came from the wild, and eventually the wild ran out. And we don't really have an idea exactly of what it was like. Its closest relative is actually asafoetida, which is, again, one of these kind of borderline smells. Some people love it, some people hate it. it's kind of like sweaty socks. uh, but if you add a little bit of it to a dish, it can make that dish really interesting. So that's one example, and there are probably many, many others.
Yeah. We have a viewer named Matt who says, if you hypothetically had to give up one of your senses, which do you think would be the worst one to lose?
Yeah, that's I've thought about that, and I just don't have a good answer. I'm very attached to all of them.
Yeah.
uh, and these days, of course, there are more and more instances of people losing their senses of taste and smell due to the virus. And in fact, that's doing, sadly, good things for the funding of research into understanding taste and smell, which are still among all of our senses, the ones that we understand the least well and have kind of taken for granted. And they are so important to the quality of life uh, that we need in order to thrive, in order to have an appetite. Yeah, we have a lot to learn still.
When On Food and Cooking came out in 1984, the culture was not at a place like we are now, where food is at the center of everything, where there was no Food Network, there wasn't a million, obviously there was no internet, there wasn't such a thing as a food blog or anything. But the last 20 years, that boulder has just rolled down the hill and collected so much speed. It You put out a revised version of that. What year, for remind me again, when the revised version came out?
2004.
Right. So that was kind of right there, right? Was that because of the change in the culture? Was the impetus for doing that because you knew that a bigger audience existed 20 years later?
It was. It was also the fact that when I wrote On Food and Cooking the first time around, I was essentially writing it for people who were kind of interested in science and kind of interested in food, because food, as you say, just wasn't that big a deal. And I figured that in the case of professionals, chefs, they already knew how to make delicious things. So, this might be of academic interest to them, but it wouldn't necessarily be anything more than that. And in fact, the established chefs of the day whom I happened to meet said basically that, that's a very interesting thing you're doing, but has nothing to do with my day-to-day work. What happened was that the up and coming generation of cooks wanted to understand what was going on. They didn't want to have to peel potatoes for 10 years in order to be allowed to touch a piece of fish. And so they really glommed onto my book as a way to kind of fast track their understanding of what was going on in the kitchen. And when I saw that happening, I kind of shifted gears. Instead of writing just for the interested amateur, I really had in mind to try to provide the professionals of the time with the information that they would not be getting from their head chefs and that they would not be getting from their culinary schools, but that would help them become cooks who understood what they were doing and therefore were able to do new things, do better things, whatever they might choose. So it was that shift that really made the difference for the second edition.
I will say to people, I believe around 2011, the book was awarded a James Beard Award. You've won several of those, and it was entered into the Cookbook Hall of Fame. So it's on the Mount Rushmore of cookbooks. But I do wonder, you mentioned the impact on chefs. Another thing that didn't exist at that time was this concept, or at least by name, or at least by popular reference, was this concept of molecular gastronomy, right? The idea of the intersection of scientific methods and cooking. I've heard many people credit you with kind of being an early person who started pushing that in that direction. Someone like a Nathan Myhrvold, who people may or may not know, who is an ex Silicon Valley, zillionaire who's now devoted his life to this pursuit. I can very much see a line between what you were interested in at that time and that. Do you kind of take any pride or ownership in that movement at all?
Not exactly. Um, First of all, I think the term is really unfortunate because it just sounds way too grand and techie than it needs to be, geeky. Um, for me, uh, what often goes by the name molecular gastronomy is simply the kind of avant-garde movement in cooking that developed in the late 90s and was especially strong in the early 2000s, and now is, kind of, I think, past its peak. And it's true that science played a big role in that, the science of cooking. And so my book was, it did very well during that period. Um, but it really had to do with the chefs of the day finally being recognized as creative individuals, which had not been the case in previous decades, and realizing that just like a potter understanding clays and glazes is going to be able to do better work than if he or she doesn't understand those things. Chefs realized the more they understood about ingredients and processes and how things actually work, the more creative they could be, the more inventive they could be. They could, depart from the established path more reliably, the more they knew. And so I've always looked at the science part of that movement as being the kind of handmaiden to the creative part. These people wanted to explore new territory, and science was a great tool for helping them do that.
Want to get to a couple more audience questions. Before I do that, I want to remind people that if you need to get a copy of Nosedive, and I will say you do need to, you can go to the chat function here and get a copy or two from us. It's a great gift as well for the people who are interested in that pursuit. So we have a viewer named Dewey who asks, is there a type of categorization of smells similar to sound? For example, high tone, low tone, loud, quiet.
Yeah, another wonderful question. And again, because of the diversity of stimuli that we're dealing with, people have actually tried over the millennia, not just the centuries, but the millennia, to find good classifications for different groups of smells. And there's still a lot of argument about that among specialists. So there are a number of different ways to categorize, and I'm not sure that any one of them is especially authoritative. What you can talk about in more objective terms is the volatility of smells. And this is something that perfumers have known forever. And in fact, they have a very well-established way of categorizing smells based on how long they last on your skin. So perfume is made up of many, many different materials, and some of them evaporate off the skin very quickly. Some kind of hang around for a couple of hours, and then others may persist to the next day. And so they call these different volatilities and materials top notes, middle notes, and base notes with the musical analogy. And that's pretty good because that's based on the physical behavior of these molecules and not any kind of subjective categorization of those molecules from experience.
So when it comes to this book, it took quite some time to write. You said, you delivered it way, way late, but you've been researching it your whole life, as have all of us, because we're constantly smelling things. I'm curious, what's a smell that you associate with joy that you just love to smell? And what's maybe, even for this book, you had to smell some pretty horrible things for the process of this book. What are a couple things that are just if you never had to smell them ever again, you would be happy not to?
Well, the second one is easier. So there's a food called surströmming, which is a fermented herring that is produced in Sweden. And you know how in the case of canned goods, we're told that if you see a can that's bulging, that indicates that something is going on inside that's not good. It's probably going to give you,
Botulism, yeah.
and so you should just toss it immediately. Well, in the case of surströmming, the herring are fermented and then canned. And then one indication of the quality of the surströmming inside is the degree to which the can has expanded to look more like a football than a can. So fermentation continues in the can, and when you open it, because it's under pressure, it sprays this stuff into the air to give you a preview of what you're about to experience. And it's pretty foul. It's yeah, fish that's rotten but enjoyed.
Did you both taste it and smell it?
Yes, yes.
Does the taste any better than the smell?
It does, and that's one of the interesting things about the sense of smell is that when we breathe in through our nose, we're much more sensitive to things than when we breathe out smells that are in our mouth because we've eaten something. So our level of sensitivity goes way down once we've decided to go ahead and put it inside our mouths. And so that does minimize the discomfort to some extent, but still, it was important for me to taste it, but I'm not going to go back.
Yeah, you took one for the team on that one.
That's right.
Well, to my first point, though, I'm really curious about, another thing that we hear about a lot is this concept of aromatherapy, and the idea that, there's even a mental health component to surrounding yourself with familiar smells. People, the candle industry, the incense industry, all these things, the diffusers, these are huge. Is that a real thing, or is it just, psychosomatic?
It does seem to be based in reality. Now, as you say, there are so many different versions of this kind of thing. And of course, people are trying to sell you stuff. So you have to take that into account. But studies have been done, and they do show that smells that people find pleasant do tend to lower their respiration rate, and they'll just be more relaxed. They'll be calmer. They'll be in that way more comfortable in whatever situation they happen to be in. And they've done this kind of test with, for example, taking tests or other things that could be stressful. The stress levels go down when you provide these smells that are familiar and pleasant. And usually the ones that have been chosen for this are lavender and citrus. So lemon and lime and orange and things like that. Now there are thick books that will list, if you're suffering from this or that kind of malady, physical or psychological, these are the essential oils that you should use to treat yourself. For that kind of thing, there's no scientific information available. But these other studies, limited though they are, do seem to suggest that there's something there, and that it's worth, if you're interested in that kind of thing, worth exploring.
Let me squeeze in one more audience question before we wrap up here. So Reed asks, food labels often list artificial or natural flavors. Are there any particular smells that manufacturers add to food? That makes me think about liquid smoke, for one thing.
Oh yeah, there are many, many thousands of manufactured smells that are added to manufactured foods. And one of the prime examples, I mean, liquid smoke it's an interesting case because it's actually made from smoke, but it's smoke that's been bubbled through water so that some of the things that are toxic about smoke are taken out. And so you can then use what's left, and it's more convenient, of course, than lighting a fire. But one of the earliest manufactured smells for food and cooking was actually vanillin, which is the main component in natural vanilla. That was synthesized for the first time in the middle of the 19th century, a long, long time ago. And if you look at the world consumption of true vanilla from the pod and vanilla flavorings from wherever they might come from, vanilla from the pod represents a tiny, tiny fraction of the worldwide consumption of that particular molecule and the smelling of that particular aroma. So if it weren't for manufacturing, plain vanilla would be an oxymoron. Vanilla would be, one of the most valuable ingredients on the planet.
Now, is it true that, I often, you could maybe bust a myth for us or confirm it to be true, that vanilla extract imitation is taken from the anal glands of a beaver? Is that true, or is that just something I've heard over time?
It has been true in the past that that castoreum, which is the name for that secretion from the beaver, has been an ingredient in vanilla extracts and in other foods because it has a particular quality that is useful to manufacturers. That's less and less the case because it used to be that there were plenty of beavers around and, it was a relatively inexpensive ingredient. Nowadays, of course, animal welfare concerns and beaver populations and so on, and just the ease of manufacturing these things in the laboratory have made that pretty much extinct.
Yeah, it makes you wonder how they stumbled upon that in the first place. So my last question to you is this: we've been all trapped inside for the past year, give or take. You're the food science guy. You wrote the book on food and cooking. Has it been easier to be in Harold McGee's house in terms of home cooking and eating these last year than some of us who have been, not as blessed in the cooking ways?
Well, actually, what I've been doing, because I have a lot of friends in the restaurant world, I've been trying to help keep them afloat by getting a lot of takeout. Yeah. So, if anything, I've been lazier in my own kitchen. That and, just being busy with getting the book out the door this last year, which it only got out the door in October. So the first part of the year was pretty busy. So I'm actually looking forward now to catching up with everyone else who's been baking.
Yeah. You're gonna have your sourdough period much later than everybody else did, I guess. Yeah.
Exactly. But I'm also going to miss the shortages of all those ingredients that happened this last year.
Yeah, who would have thought that it would be toilet paper and bread baking ingredients? But it's a strange time to be alive. I can't thank you enough for this conversation. It really was a blast. It was everything I was hoping it would be after hounding you for years to do it. So thank you for that. And I want to encourage everybody to read Nosedive. And I also, if you guys haven't read Harold's previous work, you're going to love it. One of the things I love about what you do is you kind of have this corner of the world, and it very much seems like if you look at all your work together, it all seems of a piece. It's kind of almost like a band has a discography that you can kind of consume. So I've always enjoyed looking at what you're doing and reading your work. So can't wait to see what comes next. I'm sure you're much in deserved of a break, and yeah, it's been a thrill.
Well, thank you, Jeff. I've been looking forward to this for a few years now. I'm glad we were finally able to do it.
Yeah. Well, thank you, and take care of yourself. Stay safe out there. I hope to connect down the road. And for everybody watching, stay safe out there. Pick up a copy of Nosedive and spend 2021, getting to know the smells of your world. Thanks, everybody. Take care.
Bye-bye.